One of the coolest things I think about behavior analysis was the ability to reflect and look at your own life and be able to design the behavior patterns that you're looking to develop. And that was one of the things that really hooked me into it. I can understand the world around me. I can help others. I can figure out what I want to do myself. And so during this process of learning and understanding it, I think there's a couple simple areas that you can dive into that have a lot of complexity, but a couple areas of behavior analysis are particularly useful for considering self-management. And then I want to get into a few resources and things that I found useful as well. And so part of this was developed during a what I call now, quote, a failed company, which was the Institute of Meaningful Instruction. And during the Institute of Meaningful Instruction, we tried to create a series of courses on self-management for gifted and talented students. We did pretty darn good on the behavior analysis side. It was the marketing and the business side that I learned a lot of lessons on. So it's no longer around, but I owe some credit to my colleagues for helping me put some of this stuff together and like frame this over a couple years while we formed that. All right, so first of all, I'm a really big fan of pulling in a component of acceptance and commitment therapy that's really rooted in behavior analysis. So it's a third wave behavior analytic approach to mindfulness and acceptance. For us as behavior analysts, we're particularly interested in the values component. And values are defined as things you can't have or hold. So there's a whole list of them over here that I like to point people to check out. These values, I always give the example of health. Like I can't go into the doctor and say, look, I've got it. I'm healthy, doc. I'm good to go, and walk back out. But it's things that you can move towards, right? You can set goals around them and move towards them. So you can't have them or hold them. They're freely chosen in the sense of the world around you, the stimuli that are you're interacting with are out there. You can select which ones you want to move towards. The idea is that there's this ongoing dynamic pattern. So there is never a set of values theoretically that you hold that will just be finite and like those are your values. They can change, they can adapt. How you move towards them and how you continue to engage in behavior towards them can change as well. And the cool thing there, note patterns of activity. These are behaviors that we're engaging in, so they fit within this behavior analytic worldview. And then there's some inherent like motivation built in. So these patterns are valued in and of themselves, making the process of pursuing them worthwhile. So the conceptualization is essentially that you have this built-in motivational variables as a result of defining them and moving towards them. You continue to be motivated towards pursuing them. And so a key thing here is that they are verbally constructed. And there's a number of values clarification activities that are out there. For me, they've always been interesting in like, I think this is an area where it's kind of tricky. Sometimes you have to work through it on your own, sometimes with others. We can get into that maybe afterwards. For me particularly, what I used to do is I used to look at a list of different values, some of the examples like in this little bubble here, and say, are these things important to me? And I would go through those once every month, once every week, or whenever I was kind of struggling with things and just see like, did anything change? And if so, I would start to plan around that. And so the planning component of this all is the goal setting. So behavior analysis, goal setting, we're a pragmatic field. It's super important that we do this for anything that we're targeting, working towards. The keys that we used to teach and focus on was making sure that goals had some sort of time frame, that they were set, that you're moving towards. They're observable, things that you can measure, and they occur in real time. So I'm a big fan of setting these for daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, whatever it is, checking in on these. Again, at the root, these are verbally constructed things. We can say that we want to move towards them and state them. So they fall within a pragmatic and like behavior analytic view of language and how language works, i.e. it can be influenced by motivational variables. It's triggered through SDs and followed through with consequences and impacted by those, right? But the goals for me, there's two parts. Values sits on top, and you can set your goals that are in direct that are moving you towards your values. So they link up to the values work really well. And you can set them based on each value, say, if you wanted to. But also, these goals can be like multi-level. So I can say, for example, one of them right now is like, there's this big mountain that I want to climb about 4 hours north of where I live. And so I need to figure out how to get in shape enough to do that. I do that through setting different daily goals linked to weekly goals, linked to monthly goals, in hopes of that I can maintain on that behavior through how I'm understanding my behavior, hit those goals, and live that value-directed life. So values one, goals is the second area, goal-setting behavior. And then the last one is pretty simple, daily committed action. But in hindsight, like this is always the trickiest one. Most behavior analysts know some of these, if not all of these, but there are different ways to view the world through a behavior analytic lens. And I wanted to cover a couple of them real quick and just try to kind of link and pull this up all together. So the way that I pay attention and come to have, like, I guess, been how I was originally taught about behavior analysis was that this behavior analytic worldview had 4 different areas. You had your philosophy. Everyone's like, this is super important. It's the foundations of how you're assuming the world works. There's multiple ways to approach that, of course. Then you have your experimental analysis behavior, your applied behavior analysis with all the behavioral technology afterwards. So move from right to left. Behavioral technology are the different tools, strategies, things like early intervention, early intensive behavioral intervention, or when you look at OBM, these sort of tools, strategies, technologies of how we go about implementing behavior change. Applied behavior analysis, the way I look at it, has research components to it. You're meeting all of the dimensions that Bear-Wolf and Risley lay out. And then the experimental analysis of behavior just shifts into largely more laboratory controlled, right, rate of response, and not quite as socially significant sort of outcomes, or it's harder to link those. The thing that I think was really interesting about this, though, is that for me, philosophy really determines and impacts everything that you're doing. So what we came to develop through my mentors and others when we were working on this at the Institute of Meaningful Instruction is we reframe this as each of these occur, experimental analysis, behavior, applied behavior analysis, and behavioral technology, but within your worldview. So if I approach something contextually through like the Association of Contextual Behavioral Science and how the ACT community approaches it, then it's going to be kind of driven, and the outcomes can be a little bit different than if I approach this, say, through traditional Skinnerian sense or something that's more mechanistic, etc. And so I think this is one part that one way self-management is self-management is an example of how important it is that you're clear on your worldview and how you assume the world works, because it's just going to trickle and it's going to alter the way that you might understand, approach, and interpret something. So I want to give some examples of this. So this is my interpretation of a few different models, works, primarily how I think that it kind of goes. So you can look at things through a very Skinnerian 3-term contingency perspective. You got your antecedent, you've got your behavior, and you've got your consequence. Most of us, I think, are taught, and I still teach this in like a basic course to date, as you're looking for the antecedent, behavior, consequence. You're looking for these 3 things. There's ways in which you can understand and operationally define and measure each of these, but it's very linear. Antecedent, behavior, consequence. I need to find these 3 things, and then I can start to have an understanding of how the environment and behavior are interacting. That's one way to approach Skinnerian. Now, so basically what we're saying here is we got a stimulus, a response, and a stimulus. But the post-Skinnerian sort of kind of mechanistic way is they started to add in motivation operations. So we had Jack Michael pops in. He's like, what about motivation? That's a stimulus event that we can start to measure as well. So we add that in. We have this 4-term contingency, which I think you can still approach very linearly of how do I understand my motivation, my antecedent that's triggered by behavior, and then the consequence that follows it. If I can find those 4 variables out, then I can figure this out. motivate myself, engage in the behavior more or less, whatever it is that my goal is. But it's still very mechanistic, meaning linear. Like you identify those 4 parts, and once you've identified them, it's just a matter of altering them enough to be able to move forwards. Now, the contextual perspective is very similar. I've got something separated here, which is antecedent and postcedent. It's just something that, Ernie Vargas suggests that we change consequence out with postcedent to just kind of keep it a little bit cleaner as to antecedent, postcedent, right? And get away from that connotation of consequence. But the big difference here is that behaviors change. So behaviors change from the B being where the response is now to the whole thing being behavior. And this contextualistic approach is how Skinner really talked about it. Although I think a lot of teaching and dissemination work has taught that you just have to linearly go figure out what that antecedent behavior consequence is, or that MO antecedent behavior consequence is. And while those variables are important, not getting rid of them, it's all of them interacting together that's super important here. And that's how behavior occurs. It's the relations between them all. And we all know this, right? When it comes to, for example, you have some sort of consequence, one effect of reinforcement, punishment, extinction, right? On this postcedent consequence side is that it alters the conditions, such as the antecedents, and it starts to adapt the functions that those stimuli have to be able to, in ways of creating SDs, creating S deltas, creating SDPs, right? So we know that these function altering effects happen through consequences, but we don't always necessarily, in our models, conceptualize them. And that's why I've appreciated this one, is it's just remembering that each of these have relations between them. The antecedent connects to the postcedent, the response connects to the motivation operation, etc. Like they all are connected. That's what I talk about when I mean a more contextual worldview. So this got us exploring a few different areas, though, because there was other people like Israel Golddiamond that really looked at conceptualizing your behavior non-linearly. And for him, he still had the SD, S delta, your discriminative stimuli. What happens with these is that they will signal and evoke some sort of behavior. He called it an R for a single response. And then your consequences, SR plus minus, very similar to the model that we're all used to and we're taught. He had a special SD, SDA, and SDI for either abstractional or instructional control. Think about instructional control as rules that you're taught, that you follow, and then abstractional are more rules that you've derived. That's how I've come to understand it. And so different terms, because we talk about them in different ways, and we want different behavior patterns to shape up sometimes, right? Such as when I hear the rule, I follow the rule, or if I can, or starting to learn how to engage in rule-governed behavior through many contingencies or many opportunities to learn. These still function the same way. You can have either an SD or an SDAI, an SD, S delta, or an SD A or an SDI. It totally is dependent on what you're talking about, what you're going for. And then for him, the motivation operation was separated into potentiating variables. And the idea here was very similar to that contextualistic thinking of Skinner, but potentiating variables could potentiate any part of this. So the MO, the motivation operation, is tied into that it can only alter the value of consequences and evoke or abate behavior in the moment. So it's tied into the either consequence or the antecedent based on its definition. He's saying the potentiating variables will work for your SD, S deltas, and your consequences, which are both the A's and C's from our previous one, but you can also potentiate behavior and you can potentiate your rules, so you can start to alter those. And so for him, it's a very similar term to motivation operation, but it was selected as something different because he says that it operates in a different way and that it operates on any part of this contingency diagram that I have up here so far. So since it works on any aspect of these, it was given a different name. The last thing that I think is super interesting is he talks about stimulus props. So what are the environmental variables around you that aren't in the contingencies but are still around? So what is that context? So when we talk about all the time behavior analysis or behavior occurs in a context, he had a term for this, stimulus props. These things aren't directly involved in in influencing behavior in the moment, but they are out there and they're worthwhile noting, right? These are super important. I think sometimes we just lump, paying attention to the context without being able to know like whether or not it's actually influencing behavior in the moment. And so he had a way to conceptualize and drop that in. There's two others I want to cover, and the reason I want to go through these is I think there's different lenses to look at your self-management frameworks through, and I'll tie in how we used to teach this and how it ties into the goals and the values here shortly. Two others worth noting, I think, because there's a number of conceptualizations out there. There's a really cool epigenetic behaviorist in the 40s, 50s, 60s did a lot of work named Xing-Yang Guo. And Guo said there were some determining factors to pay attention to. These 5 groups were your morphological factors. So there's certain things that I can't engage in, such as flying, because I don't have wings. I can jump off of a cliff and I can try to fly. It's not going to work. I'm going to fall into the water, die a tragic death, hurt myself, whatever it is, right? Morphological factors need to be kept in mind. For him, it was also the biophysical and biochemical factors. So he actually sequenced like what are the learning patterns and what are the environmental events that cause the different stages of an embryo in chickens, to understand how the environment starts to evoke those sort of things and evoke certain changes. I can give a quick example in a human-related world as to like why this stuff matters. There was some researchers, I remember at a Nevada Association of Behavior Analysis conference maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, where they were trying to figure out what starts to elicit the rooting reflex in children. And it turns out there was a chemical level that when it hit just the right level in the womb, it would start to elicit that. Now, it's not solely because of that chemical, if you're looking at it contextually, right? Like all of this has to come together to occur. But without that chemical involved, like you're not seeing that rooting reflex develop. Whoops. And so he added the biochemical, biophysical factors. I think behavior analysis largely does not pay attention to these. It's way over my head, and understandably so. It's almost an entire different field now at this point compared to where he was studying it. You got your stimulating objects, which he didn't break down nearly as much as we've seen in the other ones. Your developmental history that you have to keep into context here, which the history is really interesting because we haven't seen that in the other models. We talk about how important it is from Skinnerian 3-term, 4-term contingency way, but it's not built into there. And then your developmental context, again, kind of largely lumped into here. The thing that he was trying to really focus on was how do you start to build novel behavioral skills that would allow you to kind of supersede where you were as a species before. So would there be ways to understand these different categories to where you could start to, as a species, be able to adapt and change your environment that you normally wouldn't have been able to adapt to. So for example, I think about this with climate change. Like climate change is going to impact, as it looks like in the next like 50 to 100 years, like extremely significantly across the globe. So will there be ways not only to alter and reduce that, but is there ways to also, like through the environmental changes, but is there also ways to be able to understand ourselves well enough to be able to help us adapt to that situation? So looking at it as what behavioral skill sets, how can we work with our biology, chemistry, what we're given with our morphology to be able to pursue and like live under that situation in a different framework. Super cool stuff. And then the last one would be looking at Cantors, which this looks crazy, but bear with me for just a second. So all he said here was that you have an event field. There's an event that happens. The event is just stimulus and response, but he broke it down a little bit more. So if we're looking at these circles, just the main circle in the center, we have our event field or boundary. These are the things that are relevant for a behavior analyst to look at from his perspective. And so you'll see here that we have your setting factors is your blue. Think about these as motivation operations. Your history, it's called your inner behavioral history. It's red at the top and the bottom. They're the very fine dots without the dashes that's going through all of these. So the idea is that your inner behavioral history is always there. And then you have two sides of this. You have your response function, your stimulus function. He separated these because oftentimes when you talk about stimuli, people will focus just on the form that it may have. So like, you might say, a water bottle. If I'm teaching a kid to label water bottles, intact water bottles, like oftentimes you're dealing with trying to teach them the difference between the stimulus properties that this may have, and that's what he calls your stimulus object versus the stimulus functions, the different things this can do. So stimulus functions, this could be all sorts of things. It can evoke me picking it up and drinking water. It can evoke me picking up, throwing it at an intruder in my house if someone broke through the window right now. Like, there's different stimulus functions that this may serve as a result of it being a stimulus object, and you would separate the distinction between those two. And then on the other side, you've got the organism itself engaging in the response, and then what's the function of that response. We talk about this all the time. Not going to jump into those. And so for him, it was like, hey, we need to pay attention to these. This is our event field that we pay attention to all these factors, and then there's preceding segments, succeeding segments, and we can pull one of these out and look at it, but they're always just chained together, occurring over and over and over and over again. So how does this all relate to self-management sort of stuff? We used to, and I still look at it from a behavior analytic point of view, that you need to look at, how do I understand my individual behavior through one of those conceptual models? I lean towards something like gold diamonds, or I lean towards something like Cantors, kind of approach of looking at a little bit more, I guess for lack of a better word, like complex model there. Sometimes for myself, but it's kind of like pick your own. Pick your conceptual model, pick the one that you're fluent with, maybe explore them over time, bring them in, and try to understand and interpret your behavior. And whichever one's working for you, select that, move on. Oftentimes an ABC is enough to just like understand what's going on and be able to alter things. Sometimes it takes something a little bit more complex to break it down. I think the value of those more complex models is that they give you more variables, so you can potentially do a more thorough analysis if you know how to find them. Now, when we used to teach others this, there was two components I think are super important. So we're talking about teaching self-management skills to others and not self-management skills for the behavior analysts. The teaching others, I think there's a couple ways in which we used to do this. So when working with adults with intellectual disabilities and trying to teach them self-management skill sets at a previous job, we would go through the nonlinear instructional design process as best as we could. So this was developed by Twyman, Lang, Steichleather, Hobbins, some others. And the first thing would be your content analysis of what is it that we're trying to teach and understanding the content of that. So if I was trying to teach self-management skill sets, I would have to understand what the world calls self-management skill sets and read everything that's been done about self-management skill sets. At that point, you can set your objectives of what you want to teach people. So what we used to do with our online class for gifted and talented students. From there, you can set your tests as to whether or not we're going to meet these. So your goal setting comes in as to whether or not, and how you're going to measure whether or not progress has been met. And then a key part that I think that's often missed is the entry repertoire. So if I want to be able to understand how to help people out, what are the basic skills they need, so I have entry criteria of saying you are a good fit or not a good fit for this. From there, you can actually figure out your sequence. Most people do this left to right. They'll be like, oh, what skills do you need? What are we going to teach? How are we going to measure it? And then how are we going to set up our objectives? But they suggest you go through in almost this backwards fashion. They call it nonlinear for that reason. And then you take your performance data. So what's cool here is the student enters here, and they come out over here. Notice you can take that performance data. You can then alter your entire 6 variables here, but the student entering and exiting wasn't the same way in which you actually went through this. And so this is just kind of a fun fact for anybody trying to develop these sort of things. This is what these behavior analysts really suggest and found useful when building things like Headsprout reading program. And then the last thing that I try to think about oftentimes here is also the technology difference. So when we say behavioral technology, it's really built of a couple things. So a technology of tools such as your hardware, software, sensors, but then your technology of process. And it's this process side the behavior analysts are really good at. We're taught through this, we're taught many of these through our behavioral training programs, and it's the combination of the tools and the process. So to tie this together to self-management, oftentimes people are like, what tools do you use, etc. I think there's a lot of tools, hardware, services, solutions potentially out there to go look at, but it's the combination of these two that I understand as how I understand self-management, is your tools and your understanding of the contingencies and how you're conceptualizing them, those things working around you. And so where this has led me to was the self-management sort of package that I look at, which is you've got to have your values, figure out how to clarify those for yourself or those that you're working with. Under there, you've got your goal setting and how you're going to design and measure the goals that are in line with those values. And then it's your daily committed action. And really the bread and butter of this, and like figuring this out, I think is any measurement tool. I'm a fan of the standard acceleration chart. Pick what it is that you want to measure on and be able to adapt things off of. But for me, the key here is when you start to measure these things, your goal and what you can do there is align all of these. And what I think is so cool about behavior analysis and particularly self-management is through the process of being able to measure and adapt and align these, like you are now living like the, lack of a better word, like righteous life. Like you are down the path that you want to pursue. You've figured it out. And that's what hooked me into really behavior analysis, was not only that I can do this with others, but I can do this with myself. So I practice this all the time. I'm not always measuring things as meticulously as I should be. It's kind of shifted over time. But that's how I understand self-management is your daily committed action can only be really figured out through a behavior analytic lens. And that could be any of those conceptual models that I suggested. From there, that'll help you understand what's going on, how to influence, set your goals tied to your values, and then to your measurement that helps you going. It's just like values, it's an ongoing dynamic process. And unfortunately, it's never ended. You're never there. It's never perfect. And so once you get beat down by that a little bit, I think that's where you can start to figure out a process of how you cope with that and like move forward and continue your self-management day to day.